Hello and welcome to the first in what is a series of events on the E3. And in this session, we're looking at the United Kingdom and the E3. If you aren't familiar with the E3, then you're in the right place, because over these sessions, we hope to clarify what the E3 is, where the E3 has come from, but also what future it may have. And for this series of events, I'm delighted that UK Change Europe has been able to join up with the Centre for Grand Strategy at King's College London, which brings together historical and strategic expertise to statecraft, diplomacy, and foreign policy. And one of our speakers, William, is batting for that team. But let me introduce the panel, if I may. I'm Richard Whitman. I'm a senior fellow here at UK in a Changing Europe. And for this discussion, I'm joined by William James, who's from the Centre for Grand Strategy. And he's Axon Johnson Research Fellow and been at the Centre since 2022. And he's also a Senior Associate of the Oxford Changing Character of War Centre. Evie Aspinall, who's Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, and like many of you, I'm sure I'm a great fan of their work on polling and polling on British public opinion, which is fantastic. And really the job of the British Foreign Policy Group, I stand to be corrected by Evie, is really to sort of have the broadest possible debate on foreign policy and to try and draw in as many citizens, essentially, in all sorts of ways to think about foreign policy. And lastly, and by no means least, Charles Grant, who's Director of the Centre for European Reform, which is now a long-standing piece of the London and UK think tank furniture, having well and truly established its place as the outfit to think about the UK's place in Europe, think about the EU, and to provoke, I think, in terms of taking a sort of positive perspective on what the UK might do in Europe. What we'd like to do, if it's okay with you, those of you who are dialing in, you are more than welcome to join us in the discussion by introducing questions into Slido, and that allows us to see the questions, to sort of sort them and bring you in when it seems appropriate in terms of your question, and I'll get to as many of those as I can. But what I want to do is to open up really in this session looking at the UK. We'll have separate sessions looking at France, Germany, and then the relationship between all three of those states. Really is to take stock, first of all, of the UK's foreign policy. It's obviously a period of some turbulence over the last few years. Are we starting to see the sort of contours of a post-Brexit foreign policy in place, greater coherence in UK foreign policy, and perhaps to flag up some of the challenges over the next few years? So I'll come to Charles first.
Thank you, Richard. I think it's worth thinking to what extent British foreign policy may change if and when a Labour government takes office next autumn, which is obviously far from not certain, but looks quite likely. My basic thesis is that not very much will change. I think the current emphasis of the current government is obviously... Sorry, can you hear me?
I think maybe if people could mute if they're not on the call, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, mute would be a good idea. The current emphasis, obviously, on supporting Russian expansionism in Ukraine and elsewhere, working closely with Central and East European countries and Nordic countries to do so. Secondly, obviously, building a civil relationship with the European Union countries, not a very close relationship, not plugging in. Yeah, of course, yeah. I must admit, I have been borrowing them. Sorry. That's fine. Yeah, that's good. I got it for the courses, so yeah. That's better. If people can mute, that'd be great, very helpful. So, secondly, having a civil relationship with the European Union countries. They don't want to plug into EU foreign policy mechanisms. That's something that isn't for this government. But they want to have a close informal relationship. Indeed, there are very good informal contacts between the European External Action Service and the British Foreign Office at the moment. Thirdly, staying close to the US. And even if Trump comes back in a year's time, They'll try and stay close to the US. Whether they succeed is another matter. Fourthly, I think tilting, the so-called tilt to Asia, which was mentioned at the time of the first integrated review a year and a half ago. I think, you know, the British attempt to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the AUKUS deal with Australia and America on affecting security matters and nuclear submarines, the very close bilateral defence relationship with the Japanese, including cooperation on a new fighter aircraft, the trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. This shows a real tilt to Asia, which I think is quite important. And my contention would be that if a Labour government comes in, it would keep all these matters, keep all these priorities, including the tilt to Asia, but with one difference. I think the relationship with Europe would be a different priority for the Labour Party. I think Labour will want not just a civil relationship with the European Union and its members, but actually a much closer relationship, particularly in foreign policy making and defence policy making. David Lammy has spoken of a security pact with the EU, and I think there was certainly Labour would be in favour of structural links to the EU's foreign policy making machinery at official level, ministerial level, and European Council level, head of government level. And I think on defence too, they'd favour more structural links so that Britain can more easily take part in EU military missions. So those, I think, would be the main priorities of British foreign policy, which I say wouldn't change dramatically if Labour takes office a year from now.
So, Charles, I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds to me as if we've sort of re-established a kind of equilibrium in UK foreign policy after a period of turbulence. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think there's no grand strategy, but British foreign ministers don't generally do grand strategy. They're pragmatically dealing with problems as they come. But obviously, on the Middle East peace process, there's a limit to what, or the lack of a peace, the war process we should talk about. There's a limit to what Britain on its own can do. There's a limit to what the European Union on its own can do, because we're not really very significant players. That's obviously a huge issue at the moment, but I don't think we're reacting to events as everybody else is. We don't have a grand strategy for dealing with it, and I don't think the Labour Party would be terribly different from what the current Conservative government is on the Middle East issue.
Thanks, Charles. Well, William, I think that's your sort of your opener to come in, isn't it? You know, the question of grand strategy or not, but more generally, you know, what you see in terms of the contours of the UK's foreign policy.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation today. Pleasure to be with you all. I think from a security perspective, there are sort of three areas to really focus on. The first, and I think rightly, and it's been pointed out through the integrated review and the refresh and so on, is the Euro-Atlantic and the sort of central importance of that to British foreign policy. And I think within that, you can look at bolstering NATO, sustaining the Ukrainian war effort, and weakening Russia, which is identified as the most acute threat. And the way that the UK has gone about that is quite clear. You know, whether it's through being the first state to provide main battle tanks, to the Ukrainian training program in the UK, to smaller armored vehicles, and other sorts of military aid. And then, of course, there's the Ukraine Recovery Conference as well. Within NATO, the UK has also been playing quite a key role in the air policing missions and has enhanced the size of its forward presence alongside other allies. So you can kind of see how the Euro-Atlantic has been quite central to that. I think what Charles was talking about in terms of the Pacific is spot on. I would sort of, under the security banner, I would badge that under two things, really. One is sort of contributing towards regional deterrence, and you can see that through things like AUKUS, and also through the Global Combat Air Programme with Japan and Italy. And then I think there's also an argument that the UK is trying to be a sort of good international citizen in the region as well, and you can see that through the joining of ASEAN as a dialogue partner. You can see it through its involvement in the Blue Pacific Initiative and India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative as well. Thirdly, I think one of the big emphasis, a great deal of emphasis has been placed on resilience over the last few years. It's become a bit of a buzzword, but it's quite a useful bucket to encapsulate a number of things, from the UK's focus on science and technology. You could see it through the AI Summit last week, the National Cyber Force that's being set up, and also its engagement with human security challenges like climate change and pandemics. So those are the kind of three areas that I would say that the UK has been focused on. Happy to get into the weeds of what grand strategy means and why I think the UK does or doesn't do it. I would argue that it does do it and it's an inevitable thing, but it doesn't do it particularly well at some stages. But perhaps that's for a longer conversation.
Well, fascinating. I mean, one of the things that strikes me from what you had to say, William, is it feels from your points that the UK is sort of back in control. That there's a kind of coherence in terms of a definition of what the UK's interests are, a sort of ability to all of those interests, and also to pursue them in a way that looks as if it's got a significant degree of coherence. I mean, I'm not a cheerleader for FCDO or for the government, but I mean, I'm very struck that you were pretty positive on where you think the UK's foreign policy is at.
I think the sort of deteriorating security environment has really sharpened minds and it's enabled people to focus on certain key issues, whether that's Ukraine, the situation evolving as well in the Indo-Pacific. And when that happens, I think that it helps to hone the mind on certain things, and that gives a coherence to foreign defense policy that is sometimes lacking in more kind of permissive security environments.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks very much. Well, to encourage those who are listening in, if you want to probe a little bit more, ask our speakers anything on what they've had to say, then please drop your questions into the Slido. We picked up a few questions, so also if you want to sort of vote those up, then that would be great also. Evie, we've been talking a lot about some of the big themes in UK foreign policy, let's say the coherence within the kind of things that the government is focusing on. Is that your take on where we're at?
So I'm perhaps a little more pessimistic about the current state of strategizing. And I think for me, the epitome of that was that we had the integrated review in 2021, which was a genuinely important kind of first stab at what the UK's strategy could look like. The fairly glaring omission is they didn't really talk that much about Ukraine, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the integrated review 2023, which was the refresh, is quite a different document in many ways. Some of the themes, as William says, are kind of consistent, and there are areas that we can tell that, are clear priorities for the UK, particularly, for example, Ukraine. Resilience is now really hot topic. I think the difference between those documents is the second is much more somber. It feels much more pragmatic. Lots of the image of global Britain, which was in the first document, has kind of fallen by the wayside. And actually, you don't hear Rishi Sunak talking about global Britain in quite the same way anymore. What I see now is that the UK is being more pragmatic in terms of its partnerships. There's a lot more focus on, okay, who are our partners in the world and who can we cooperate with? I think the real areas where I see kind of a lack, perhaps, of coherence for me is China. I remember doing an interview maybe about 3 months ago. Cleverly was going to China and everyone was talking about how the UK and China were going to be friends again and we were like rebuilding relations. Then there was all the controversy around the spy in Westminster, and very quickly that's kind of fallen by the wayside again. And I think there are many relationships like China where actually we haven't yet crafted out exactly what it looks like. And the official line is that we partner where it makes sense to, we look at security, we challenge where we need to. The challenge is that's very, very vague, and it inevitably has to be. But the challenge of foreign policy is always kind of creating a clear strategy is quite difficult. It's very important, but not an easy feat. I think the other thing that to me shows that we've still got a challenge around strategy is around the Middle East, which again isn't a big focus in the IR refresh at all, and now is really the kind of one of the biggest security questions and foreign policy questions for the UK. So I think the challenge we have is that we're trying to carve out a position for ourselves post-Brexit. What does our role look like? The challenge is that the world around us is constantly changing. And so what our role will be constantly changes as well. And as Charles alludes to, there's lots of questions as well. If we get a new government in a year or so, or even sooner potentially, what will that do for foreign policy? As Charles says, I think much of it will stay the same. I think where I perhaps differ is I'm less confident that the Labour will maintain the Indo-Pacific tilt as strongly. I think everything that's already been agreed, it will agree to, but I don't see Labour Party pushing as hard as the Conservatives have towards the Indo-Pacific tilt, because I do think there'll be a stronger focus on Europe.
Thanks, Hebe. And drawing on your expertise in terms of what the public thinks, I mean, all of those things you've described, I mean, are they aligned with where sort of public sentiment is in terms of thinking what Britain's place in the world should be and the kind of things that Britain's foreign policy should be occupied with?
Generally, yes. So I think the real takeaway is Britons are very, very supportive of the UK's role in Ukraine. So 85% of Brits believe that we should be sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and all forms of aid and support we've given Ukraine have a very strong majority of support kind of across the board. So I think Ukraine is one where there's a very clear public kind of perception. China, the British public is similarly kind of slightly confused, not hugely clear on it exactly where it lies. What we do see, though, is that Britons are very interested in the UK's role in the world, and particularly they want to take an active and moral role in the world. So, for example, when it comes to China, the role we do see support for is moral support for tackling climate change, for cooperation on those big global ethical challenges, and for challenging China on human rights and issues like that. So there's a moral stance to a lot of what the UK wants to do. You see the same in when it comes to aid. So Britons want to prioritise those most in need rather than actually what might make strategic sense for the UK in terms of our aid. So I think that's a really important kind of perspective to kind of focus on, because people, I think, assume Britons only care about the economy. Actually, in foreign policy, they care a lot about morals and values as well.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, we're picking up some comments in the chat, very partly stimulated by the question about resilience and strategy and so on. We'll come back to those a little bit later, maybe. But I wondered if we could sort of turn to Europe, broadly understood. I mean, in different ways, you've all touched on Europe, and Charles has taken on or identified how Labour might feel differently. We're going to look at the relationship between the UK, France, and Germany in a moment. But I wondered if you could sort of paint a picture, each of you, as to how you think the UK fits into Europe now. As a large European state outside the EU, how that fits with some of those priorities that we've already heard, and perhaps also how difficult it might be for the UK to sort of make its place in Europe, particularly with both the sort of NATO agenda driven by Ukraine, but the EU agenda also driven by Russia's war on Ukraine. So maybe back to Charles, if that's okay.
Well, I think the problems in Ukraine and with Russia have actually brought the British much closer to their former partners in Europe than perhaps many of us expected. I think particularly the rapprochement between Emmanuel Macron and Rishi Sunak, which has been quite effective, and other relationships that Sunak has built with other European leaders, are partly a function of the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war has made everybody realise that in security terms, we have a hell of a lot in common. We have very similar interests, very similar values, very similar priorities. It's not really the case for economic issues. We won't perhaps stray too much into that, but in terms of the EU is now becoming more French, more protectionist, more focused on industrial policy, more focused on lots of state aid, more focused on government spending money to produce new technologies, which isn't the British approach at all. So when it comes to the economic side of the relationship, I think we're beginning to diverge in terms of our fundamental philosophies to some degree. And I don't think even with the Labour government we're going to get dramatically closer economically. They will get a bit closer in certain ways probably. But where I think it's pretty obvious we need to get closer is security. And I think that the EU would have been quite happy to have the UK, as I said before, having structural links to the EU's foreign policy and defence machinery post-Brexit. Boris Johnson's, when he became Prime Minister, initially signed up to a political declaration saying that he would do that. He and David Frost, his chief negotiator, later changed their mind and didn't want those formal links. But I think on the EU side, people would be very happy indeed. Just one example of how I think our interests are converging, and Evie mentioned China. I think what's interesting from a EU point of view is actually that the British line on China is actually much closer to the European mainstream than it is to the United States. The US is much tougher on China than the Europeans are. The Europeans, of course, are divided and have various views, but the mainstream European view is rather like James Cleverly said in his big China speech earlier this year. We should engage them on issues like climate, global health, economic issues, criticize them when they misbehave, but we have to actually work with China to solve a lot of global problems. That is the British view. It's the mainstream European view. And I think, Britain inviting China to the AI summit in London and James Cleverly's own visit to China are indicative of that kind of rapprochement. So I don't think the British are all over the place on China. I think they are. Evie's right; they're a bit all over the place, but I think they've got a coherent line, which is sort of middle of the road. We want to have our cake and eat it. We want to benefit from the Chinese economic relationship and get trade and investment, but we also want to have the freedom to criticize them when they do things we don't like. So that's just an example of how I think our fundamental interests are very closer to Europe. I think the Europeans realize that and would be very happy if either formally and or informally we build close relationships. Perhaps later in this conversation we'll come on to what kind of structural institutions might facilitate such relationships and whether they should be the EU or smaller structures such as the E3.
Great, thanks, Charles. Evie, so we've obviously got some sense as to how UK foreign policy is playing out. But how far do you see some of those things that Charles has identified within Europe and challenges for Europe and UK connectivity to Europe being a little bit in tension with the kind of things that the UK might want to do internationally and how it might want to profile itself internationally? I was struck by Charles's point about perhaps pulling in different directions when it comes to thinking about economic security questions and let's say the sort of the philosophy of the political economy of the UK as opposed to the EU. Is that your sense as well?
I definitely think there are challenges. I think we kind of had that post-Brexit conversation when we all talk about was the freedoms we'd got from Brexit and how we could diverge from the EU. I think that kind of heightened talk about Brexit has died down. We're now in a position where across the political spectrum and across the public, there is support for kind of cooperation with Europe. The challenge is, as Charles points to, there are points where it really makes sense and you can see the opportunities to do so. There are others where there are clear challenges. To me, the first and foremost is kind of the lack of informal engagement and mechanisms at the moment between the UK and many of our European partners. Actually, it's very irregular, but that we meet many of them, and our opportunity to cooperate and collaborate is quite limited. And you also have to think that the challenge is whenever you try and create any mechanism, and I'm sure we'll touch on this kind of when we talk a bit more about the E3, the challenge with organized groups like that is that actually, if you're in the EU, your incentive is to maintain the importance of the EU, the integrity of EU institutions. And the challenge for the UK when it's outside of the EU is finding routes by which it can constructively cooperate with European partners that aren't using the EU itself, or maybe it is using the EU itself, at which point there are slightly more challenges. We might be off kind of away from some of the biggest challenges around Brexit and the rhetoric around it. Nonetheless, particularly for the Conservatives, you're not going to see huge swings towards UK-EU cooperation because there isn't the support for that within the Conservative Party itself. So there are still challenges to be fixed there. And I also think there's a broader question of kind of mutual distrust that's been built up over recent years, kind of around cooperation. And also ultimately a bit of ego. The UK wants to make Brexit work without the EU. The EU wants to make the EU work without the UK. And there is something in there around politics that you've got to kind of overcome some of those challenges. And if we can, as Charles said, I think there are opportunities for us to cooperate. It won't be every time. And increasingly, we're seeing routes where there are different perspectives. But to me, the Indo-Pacific probably is one of the best opportunities that we could collaborate on. France and Germany are doing lots in the Indo-Pacific, and there are opportunities there that we can harness if we can get past kind of some of the politics around it.
Great. We're gonna come back to this question of where it makes sense and where it might be possible to cooperate from the UK's perspective. But maybe before we get along to that, William, I mean, is your take the same in terms of where you see the UK fitting into Europe? We've got a bit more coherence, but there is still a bit of disconnection. I
think Charles is right that Ukraine's helped, but I think there's a risk of presentism in just thinking this is a kind of recent thing for the UK. I mean, so if we just sort of look back historically, I'll come to sort of the post-Brexit period in a second, but during the Cold War, when the UK was mulling over retrenchment from its sort of days of empire, east of Suez, that sort of thing, one of the reasons for that retrenchment was because the UK was under such pressure from its European allies to maintain its NATO obligations. So the sort of European perspective has always been first and foremost for British policymakers. Today, we're going to be talking about the E3. If we think about the foundation of the E3 in 2003, that was right after the rupture over Iraq. So it was, again, the UK trying to make and rebuild its bridges after the rupture that happened over the Iraq war with France and Germany. If we kind of come forward again to Brexit, and I can completely understand what I was saying about the economic aspect, but from the security point of view, the UK made an unconditional commitment to European security throughout the Brexit negotiations. This was clear from the get-go, and it annoyed a lot of I think Brexiteers to some extent, because it meant that the UK was leaving one of its sort of trump cards off the table. But the UK made it clear it was not going to make that part of the negotiations. It was heavily involved in different parts of European security architecture that were not related to the EU, whether that's the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force of France, France's E2I initiative. And then of course there's the Joint Expeditionary Force that it has with the Northern European states. Even with the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, since that's been announced, you've seen the UK provide a commitment to Sweden and Finland in their interim stage between joining NATO. So I think, I would just sort of gently say that whilst there have been certainly tensions at the economic level, I think the security aspect is fairly consistent and has been for quite a long period of time.
Thanks very much. So what would be good to do now is to think a little bit about the whole range of relationships that the UK's got. Obviously, we're interested, for the purpose of this series, in the relationship between the UK, France and Germany, the so-called E3 relationship, which was born in the period in which the UK was an EU member state, obviously emerged in particular context, which was the nuclear diplomacy with Iran. But had a particular birth, and there are questions about whether it still has as much credence outside the EU, and we'll come back to that. But I really want to get a sense of how far we've got sort of coherence in the whole range of relationships. So, we know very well, of course, the EU-UK relationship was difficult from 2016 onwards, certainly until the change of prime minister here most recently, and that had an impact on bilateral relationships, obviously. And I'd like to hear from each of you, how you see it having an impact, particularly on the relationship with France and Germany. But as William's already said, the UK's sort of been up to all sorts of minilateralism as well, doing all kinds of things, particularly in the security sphere, with other member states. So, we've got the EU on the one hand, and we might say that relationship is sort of stabilized. At least there's a form of détente, I would suggest. But we've also got these other bilateral, minilateral things going on. I mean, is this working for the UK? And how would you characterize the most important relationships for the UK at this time? And is the relationship with France and Germany for the UK in a good place or not? I'll come back to Charles again first.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I think relations between France and the UK got really bad when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. They were absolutely toxic. Johnson and Macron just got very angry with each other. Macron's attitude to the COVID business and the drugs that were treating COVID, saying that they were going to kill people, really upset Boris and his gang. And Boris's maverick behaviour, which is a polite way of putting it, obviously upset Macron and his people. But because Sunak is kind of calm and sensible and serious, the relationship is much better now. I wouldn't say it's very warm, but I say it's fairly constructive. There's particular on defence issues. I think the French complained that although they would, in theory, have a close bilateral relationships following the Lancaster House Accords, there isn't much substance in it. There's no current, apart from something in the missile sphere, I think there's no current joint defence industry project between the British and the French. And I think the French are slightly split in the way they view the British on security, because Macron keeps on saying he wants to anchor the British in European security, and I think he does. I think it's genuine. But at the same time, France pushes the interests of the French defence industry quite ruthlessly to the UK's disadvantage, kicking the British out of the Galileo satellite project, designing the European Defence Fund in ways to make it almost impossible for British firms to take part, for example. And so I think on the one hand, I think the French are ambivalent over whether they really want the UK to link to the EU itself on defence. I think the French certainly want a close bilateral relationship with the UK, a privileged relationship with the UK, because the French are so fed up with the Germans on defence. And by the way, in parentheses, I've been following Franco-German relations since the late 1980s. I think they're as bad as they've ever been at the moment, the Franco-German relationship, but that's by the by. So I think the French are not clear on whether they want the UK to have a close relationship with the EU or not, because one reason why the French are quite glad about Brexit, and some of them are glad, is because they can then push European defence in the way they want to push it. The EU is now doing more and more in defence. It's doing joint defence procurement. It's doing the European Peace Facility funding armaments for Ukraine. It's doing more and more on its own, particularly in the defence industry sphere, and it's got a reaction force in the works, an intervention force deriving from the European strategic compass. So the French are quite happy that the British are not part of the EU, stopping them ruling the roost in the EU defence organisation. But at the same time, they kind of miss the EU's presence. So I think that's maybe my take on the French. Just very briefly on the Germans. I mean, there's quite a good relationship with the Germans at the moment. I've just come back from Germany, and the German government is quite upset that the Rishi Sunak has not been to Germany and has no plans to go there, and that upsets the Germans. There's a big issue about Saudi jets. Germany is vetoing the export of a new group of Eurofighters to Saudi Arabia for human rights reasons. The British are quite upset about that, and that is not being unblocked at the moment, I think. We have different views on the Middle East and Russia from the Germans, slightly different views, but not very different views. And I think there is a question as to how seriously the Germans really take the UK. I mean, although so they're a bit annoyed that Sunak hasn't been there, it's noticeable at this year's Königswinter Conference, which brings together German and British politicians, think tankers, and journalists and so on. The Germans provided almost no politicians at that event, and they never do. They don't take it as seriously as the British do, because we're less important to them than they are to us. So the Europe minister turned up for 15 minutes and then went, and there were almost no other German politicians at the Königswinter this year, and that happens almost every year. So I think there is a question as to how much important the Germans attach to the UK relation. But it's fairly calm. Sunak and Scholz get on fairly well, even if they don't meet very often.
Charles, a couple of follow-ups, if I may, on that. I mean, one, I'd like to hear a little bit more. You touched on the sort of state of Franco-German relations, and I guess my question is, what's the UK take on the state of Franco-German relations? I mean, you could say, is there an opportunity in there, or is it just the UK is completely out of the picture? But also, other relationships that the UK's cultivated more recently, Italy, for example, the Baltic states, Poland, and so on. I mean, are there just other relationships that look and feel more significant for the UK than the Franco or the relationship with France and Germany?
Well, before I get on to that, just very briefly on Franco-German. I mean, partly it's about personalities. Scholz and Macron are about as different as you can possibly imagine two politicians to be. One is demonstrative, talks a lot, has lots of ideas, likes hogging the spotlight, and is theatrical. The other is none of those things, and they just don't get on at a personal level. But on substance, I mean, they're particularly on problems on defence procurement issues. The Germans keep on buying American equipment, which upsets the French. And although there is a joint fighter project, the future combat air system being developed between France and Germany at the moment, I would not be surprised if that collapses, because the vibes I'm getting on both sides are very bad on that. Secondly, energy, nuclear power. Obviously, the French are committed to nuclear power, and the Germans don't want them to get subsidies on that. Thirdly, fiscal rules. The Germans are upset that the French have persuaded the European Commission to revise the EU's fiscal rules so that countries can borrow quite a lot when they want to borrow without strict discipline limiting their borrowing abilities. So things are really quite. Having said that, I mean, although they're very bad at the moment, they both know they have to agree in the end. And on the big strategic issues, I mean, such as EU enlargement, which they're both broadly in favour of, and the war in Ukraine, which they're both broadly supportive of Ukraine, they do agree, actually. So I don't want to exaggerate, but it certainly creates some chaos in Brussels that the two most important members of the EU don't get on very well together. That means the EU doesn't function very well at the moment, because the EU normally functions when France and Germany get together and have a common line, and then it's not doing that very often. On your other point, Richard, I think the Italian relationship is interesting. Italy has traditionally been a very weak player in the EU itself, but it's an important G7 member, and Sunak's built a good relationship with Meloni. They agree about being tough on migration. But incidentally, Meloni's got a very close relationship with von der Leyen, also in the European Commission. So that's important. With Spain, things are difficult. It hasn't been in the newspapers. The Gibraltar business is in some crisis at the moment. The current Spanish Foreign Minister, Mr. Alvarez, has taken a very tough line on Gibraltar, and there is no deal yet as to how the UK, Spain, and Gibraltar fits into the post-Brexit arrangements. And there's a risk that the Spanish will actually close the border altogether and cause huge chaos to the Gibraltarian economy. So I think with Spain, it's not easy. With Poland, the Conservative government has had quite a constructive relationship with the outgoing Law and Justice government in Poland. But because of that, it may be harder for the UK to maintain such a good relationship with the new centre-right government that is likely to come in, led by Donald Tusk in a month or two's time. So that may be a little bit of a problem for the UK.
Thanks very much. William, so, the UK is one of the big three, and, the E3, has its origin really in these three key diplomatic interlocutors. My apologies to Italian and Spanish listeners to this, but it was really conceived of, and one might reasonably expect that the relationship between the three would be a substantive relationship, not least for good historic reasons, but also in terms of the sort of international relations of Europe, if you like. I mean, do you have any sense that there is a sort of coherent story that could be told about the relationship between the three in broad terms and how they might work together? We'll get into the weeds on the E3 in a while, but what's your readout?
Well, I think from a bilateral perspective, I think the UK's relationship with France, there is a pretty good story to tell, in the sense that states often have choppy relations at the surface between their political leaders. Even the so-called special relationship with the US, whilst there are deep undercurrents of cooperation in the intelligence and nuclear realms, there can often be tensions at the political level. And I think that's actually true of the UK and France as well. Charles is right about the tensions we've seen since Brexit and sort of slightly being repaired by Sunak. But whilst that's been going on, you've seen UK Chinooks helping, the RAF helping in Mali. You've seen the French helping the British with the enhanced forward presence in Estonia. You've seen cooperation now, or the idea of sharing carrier deployments in the Indo-Pacific coming up in 2025. There's a lot of officer exchanges that happen that's sort of beneath the surface that no one really hears about, where you get British officers serving directly in the French military and vice versa. And then also, quite uniquely, I think, in sort of bilateral relationships, the UK-French nuclear relationship is quite strong, where they both jointly operate a centre near Dijon for maintaining nuclear stockpiles. This is not something that is par for the course in bilateral relations typically. So it does show the strength of institutional trust between the two. Now, going to defense procurement, Charles is right. The missiles has been a success story, but I think that the two have often competed in the defense procurement space and defense industry space, and that's most evident now in the rival programs for the next generation fighter jet that's taking place. With regard to Germany, I think that there's nowhere near the same degree of operational collaboration that we see between the UK and France. Between the UK and France. The defense procurement slide's slightly better, with some notable successes like the Eurofighter. But even then, when it's come to export of that in recent years, Germany stood in the way of UK export orders. And I think when we look at the reasons for this and then compare why the UK and France are seemingly better at working together at an institutional level, I think it comes down to differences in strategic culture. The UK and France being quite activist states in terms of their foreign defense policies, And I know the Labour government has said that it would like to make a treaty with the the Labour Party, so that if it wins power, speaking too soon perhaps, if the Labour Party wins power, it'd like to make a treaty with the Germans on foreign and defence affairs. That would be very interesting. But again, whether that can override these differences in strategic culture is certainly questionable.
Great, thanks. Evie, is this your? I mean, how do you read the three sides of this triangle? You know, the relationship. Obviously, you know, the Franco-German one is probably the most familiar, I suspect, to people in terms of the institutional development. You know, the long-standing nature of the relationship. What's your feeling about the UK fitting?
I think William's point around the strategic kind of perspectives within UK and Germany is particularly important. I think the UK-German relationship has less volatility in it than the UK-France one has had in recent years. But the real challenge to me is that Germany has the power to be the leading military force in Europe if it fully commits to its kind of commitments over the last year to Siebenländer. Apologies for the term of terrible German pronunciation, but it's kind of shift, kind of militarization to a greater extent. If it does that, it'll be a leading force on defense. But there's a real challenge, kind of the mindset shift required to do that, both among politicians and among the domestic public. There's a lot of change required. There's also lots of change required around Germany's perspectives on Russia. We've seen a big shift in the last year, but actually German-Russian relations have been much closer than kind of the UK has had in a long time. And similarly, German-China relationships also pose a challenge. So I think on the security side, actually Germany, there's quite a lot of questions where we really want to see Germany stepping up more. And actually increasingly, which we haven't really touched on yet, is the quite likely and growing prospect, maybe not likely, but growing prospect of a Trump presidency again soon. We're going to really rely on our partners in France and Germany, particularly on European security. And actually those relationships are going to be ever more important. The one thing I think we haven't really touched on yet on France is the question of channel migration. So while we had kind of the UK-France summit early this year, and there was some positive movements, particularly on migration there, and we do see that Sunak and Macron do get on better than Johnson and Macron did. There are still real big challenges to be addressed around migration. It's one of the biggest issues for the British public and will inevitably be very hotly politicised over the next year going into an election. And that has real consequences, I think, for the UK-France relationship.
That's great. Well, from all of your intervention, I mean, I think I've got a good sense of where the UK's foreign policy is at. I think I've got a reasonable sense of where the UK is at in Europe, although some question marks of what the near term and long term might look like. And I think we've had a good sense of what the sort of temperature of the relationship is, bilaterally between the UK and France and Germany. What about this E3 format then? These three working together on foreign and security issues. For those of you who are perhaps less familiar with where it comes from, we've done an explainer at UK to Change Europe, and the link for that is in the Slido if you're interested. But is it a format which really is sort of in search of purpose, I guess, is my question. And if it does have a purpose, what kind of purpose do you think it might be? William, over to you first.
Well, thank you. And, you're really the one to ask on this because you've written some great papers on this, both recently and in the past. But I think that, you're right when you said it sort of emerges in 2003 with has a particular focus on Iran. And since then, though, the number of issues that they've have had statements on together has proliferated quite remarkably. So there's things on South China Sea, North Korean missile tests, the Kosovo tensions, Israel-Palestine. So it's become quite a useful crisis management tool, I think, for the three states. And I think that the flexibility of it is why all three of them buy into it, chiefly. And the question then is sort of the E3 as opposed to what? And I think that oftentimes other states have come in on board with the E3 as signatories. I think Italy did recently on one of the Israel-Palestine statements. But the UK, for example, has been prone to say, right, okay, well, maybe we won't do this with the E3, we'll do this with our Five Eyes partners and have a statement on Hong Kong, or we'll make this a wider G7 thing. So I think it's, from the UK's perspective, it's one tool among many for minilateral kind of crisis management, essentially, and presenting a united front on specific issues.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about the UK. Has done a bit of venue shopping, hasn't it, over the last few years, and tried different formats in terms of working with others. And I guess one of the things that's been very prominent over or since Russia's war on Ukraine has been the G7 and the Quad. The Quad is the E3 plus the US. Charles, is it just a sort of legacy setup? Interesting as an arrangement, but not really worth a lot more than just a place to coordinate on nuclear diplomacy towards Iran?
I don't see massive potential in it, Richard. I mean, I think Tony Blair did, and Tony Blair tried to build up the E3 as an important format. But of course, if you do that, you get into problems. Firstly, the Italians really hate it, and the Spanish really hate it, and the Poles really hate it, and the Commission really hates it because it seems to be an alternative to the EU. So you upset all sorts of people if you do it. So it has been useful on Iran. I don't think it's been a fundamentally great value in other areas. Interesting, just very recently, I was speaking to quite a senior chap in the Foreign Office who was saying to me the area where it would make very much sense is defence industry cooperation. To get if you want to have a serious European defence industry, you need to get the British, French, and German defence industries working together. There have been various attempts at that since the 1990s, and most recently, I think Angela Merkel, about a dozen years ago, I forget exactly when, vetoed a merger between Airbus and British Aerospace, which would have helped to bring that about. I don't think in the long run I hope that idea might come back. I think it makes eminent sense. But as you said, Richard, has been some forum shopping, and I think the British have looked at the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a useful way of bringing the British together with Nordics and Baltics. Macron proposed a European Security Council, which implicitly would only include the serious countries in military terms a few years ago, but the Germans hated it because they thought it'd be anti-EU, so the Germans put the kibosh on that. Then Macron has come up with the European Intervention Initiative, which the British are part of, but I don't think that does very much. It's a dozen countries in it. So there's no one format. Just finally, Norbert Röttgen, the quite influential German Christian Democrat, said recently at an event I was at, the EU is not very good at doing foreign and defence policy, so maybe the EU3 or it could be a Quad or a Quint is actually a more useful body for taking forward a joint European approach to key security challenges. So he was putting that forward as a thesis, but that's obviously not the German government's position. The German government would think he was a bit anti-communitarian in saying that, but I think it'll remain on people's agenda, but I'm not sure it's going to get very far in terms of actual practical implementation.
Thank you. Well, in our chat, there's been a few suggestions as to where the E3 might have a role to play. Omar has suggested that, could it be a useful interlocutor on a two-state solution in Israel, Palestine, as well as broader Middle Eastern issues. China has cropped up both in the chat, but I think also obviously interventions that have been made here. So, is that another area where things might be possible to have a conversation, amongst states that sort of think in terms of big and broad issues, partly as a consequence of being in the G7, and obviously in the case of France, permanent member of the European Security Council. And these are all sort of very loose questions for you, Evie. I mean, if we hadn't have had it, would we want to invent it now, or do you think it's just a sort of format that doesn't have utility for where Europe's at and where the UK is at?
I think in theory you can see the rationale for the E3 being useful, and as you've mentioned, kind of the Middle East and China particularly seem like pertinent ones, though I would question how easy it'd be to get consensus between the three on the Middle East at the moment. I think that would be a challenge. There are definite divergences in perspectives there. But I do think that at the moment, there really isn't the political will in any of the three nations to really put the oomph behind it that it would require. If you look at the integrated review, the E3 is mentioned once. It's mentioned once in the refresh as well. And in the latter, it's really focused particularly on nuclear. Where I think in theory it could be most useful is in those kind of crisis management points. And that's where we've seen it used in the past, and particularly in areas where there isn't already European EU policy, because that's the real challenge with it. France and Germany don't buy into it because they're scared of kind of circumnavigating existing EU policy and alienating their EU partners. So it's got to be in areas where there isn't already kind of clear EU policy, which actually in foreign policy and security is quite a lot of areas. The challenge will increasingly be that the EU wants to act as a foreign policy and a security actor. So those areas might actually be narrowing. And then I think the other real route for it is if it can be really quite flexible. So for me, going back to the United States, you can if you brought in the United States and use the Quad, that I think could be quite a powerful format forming. If the United States becomes increasingly isolationist under a potential Trump government, I think the E3 again becomes more powerful because you've got a greater focus on European security within Europe. And actually E3 is quite a useful grouping to kind of get particularly Germany thinking about European defense and security. So I think there are opportunities where it could work. Similarly, if there were specific issues that you might bring in Poland, when you're talking kind of regional issues of particular pertinence to Poland, or specific nations in when and where it makes sense to, that's when I think you get more buy-in. But the question then becomes, okay, well, why don't we just do it through the G7? Why don't you do it through the G20? All these other groups that already exist. It hasn't yet found its purpose beyond the nuclear. There are some, but it would require, I think, quite a lot of buy-in to kind of make that the case for that.
No, I think that's a very well made set of points. That and I guess the question I have back for William and then Charles is can you imagine some sort of trigger that may actually bring it back into or energize the format, shall we say, rather than it's sort of slightly below the radar, a bit underpowered at the moment. I think in a way, Evie's suggestion that Trump may be the thing, or transatlantic relations may well be the thing that potentially has that capacity to energize it. But can you think of other issues that might have the potential? And conversely, if nuclear dialogue with Iran disappears, or even playing lip service to it, because I think that's what's happening at the moment, if that goes, then is there any reason or purpose to have the format at all, because of the other places where France, Germany, and the UK meet? So William first, and then Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything Evie just said. I think if we think back to 2015, when the original Iran deal was signed, perhaps people might have thought, well, maybe there's no need for the E3 anymore after its conclusion. They've done some other work, but not that was its sort of raison d'etre. Then, of course, what happens in 2016, you have Brexit and Trump in the same year. And I think that gave the E3 a new lease of life, both through the need for the UK, France, and Germany to have some sort of coordination mechanism during the difficult Brexit years process, and then also to keep in touch regarding what was happening with American foreign policy at the time. And as Evie says, there's a real risk that comes back again next year. And I think that if there is another Trump tenure in the White House, and the E3 would definitely take added importance. Although I would also emphasize the point there, which I think she was making, that I don't think there's political will to kind of institutionalize this in any way. I think that all sides are kind of fairly happy for a variety of reasons, whether it's what Charles has said around other European states getting being annoyed about being frozen out, or the European Union not liking it. I think that from the French and German side, there's not much incentive to institutionalize, and I think from the British side is the same, but for different reasons. But other areas, I think Charles has already mentioned the defence space. There was an attempt to bring the defence ministers together in 2020, which doesn't seem to have taken off. So perhaps there isn't the willpower there for that. But the UK, France, and Germany are some of the only states to have deployed hard power to the Indo-Pacific. And I think that perhaps in conjunction with the Dutch and the Italians, there's an argument for saying, is there a mechanism there for the Europeans to start coordinating their presence and their messaging on the Indo-Pacific more? The E3 plus would be a way of doing that, whether that's E3 plus Netherlands or whoever it would be. That seems to be a logical framework for that kind of initiative.
I mean, just before I come to you, Charles, just to pick up on a point in the chat where Ben Kinsler says whether the AUKUS agreement caused long-term damage to UK, France more broadly, UK-EU relations, sort of fit with William's point. I mean, is the Indo-Pacific a bit too difficult, or is everybody on their best behaviour post-AUKUS, and therefore that might be one place that it's possible to cooperate more, has been the case in the past. So, but more generally, are you a sort of E3 optimist or an E3 pessimist in terms of its future possibilities?
On AUKUS, I think the French are more or less calmed down about it. They were particularly upset because they regard themselves as a Pacific power and thought that the UK would be a very good partner for them in the Pacific, and that they hope to work together in Pacific security questions. So when AUKUS came along, and the fact that the British and the Australians kept it a secret from the French and actually lied to them about what was happening before the deal was unveiled, created a lot of bad blood. But I think that's been more or less blown over now. More generally, I think Evie's absolutely right. I think if Trump comes back, that is a game changer. I think that there's two possibilities if Trump comes back. To quote what a very senior EU diplomat said to me recently, if he comes back and remains committed to European security through Article 5, we'll put up with an awful lot of SIJT from him. But if he pulls out of European security completely, as he threatened to do last time he was the president, then everything changes. And then I think then some sort of triangular format between the UK, France, and Germany will be very important for dealing with European security questions. I mean, at the moment, I think that others will know better than me. I think the Quad is actually very useful and effective format, Britain, France, Germany, and the US within NATO. But if Trump does pull out of NATO, then obviously that is no longer a useful format. So I think I'd conclude by saying post-Brexit, we need more formats, more ventures, more initiatives for tying the British into conversations about European security and Europe more generally. That's why the European political community, which we haven't mentioned, is actually quite useful, a useful innovation, Macron's invention. I think the E3 can be part of that. And I think other formats can also be part of it. And I think that William is right that a sort of E3 plus format, sometimes the Dutch, sometimes the Italians, could be useful for defence questions. And I think we're all going to be working together at lots of different organisations at lots of different levels. And post-Brexit, it's really important the British are ready to take part in all these various initiatives and all these various levels and all these various formats. I'd say in the E3 can be quite an important part of that.
Well, that sort of takes me to what was my final question for the three of you, which is really whether the sort of the road to E3 success or revitalization, re-energization sort of runs through Brussels, in the sense that you started off, Charles, by talking about Labour's ambitions for a closer relationship in the foreign security and defence policy area, and my take on the E3 would be one of the reasons why it became a more tricky format is because that kind of agreement wasn't in place, and so there's a bit of an anxiety that the UK might seek to sort of backseat drive EU foreign policy through formats like the E3. How closely do you think those things are connected, or is there a different dynamic at work? Maybe Evie first.
I think you're spot on. I think the real challenge for any form of grouping, and particularly a formalized grouping outside of the EU, is that will always be seen as kind of the UK trying to use a backdoor into the EU. And in some ways, it kind of is. And there's some justified skepticism, particularly in places like Italy and Spain, of any grouping. And I think that will be the real challenge, is that we either we need to improve relations with the EU in the first place to now enable these other groupings to kind of to operate, and for the EU to be happy for that. But at the same time, if you improve those relations with the EU, you may as well kind of operate through the EU in more formal ways and often and get more structured cooperation that way. So yeah, I do think it runs through Brussels as much as through what we ourselves in the UK would like to see.
Great, thank you. William.
So I think it does run through Brussels in the sense that NATO is also based in Brussels as well. So I think the first thing to say is that the UK will be an important player in European security, regardless of whether or not there are closer relations between the EU and the EU foreign defence policy mechanisms. There are simply too many reasons for this, whether it's the UK's own interest in European security, to the fact that many other states in Europe regard the UK as an important ally through NATO or through things like JEF, and the Baltic states are good evidence of this. But it's certainly true that the mood music has definitely improved between the UK and the EU over the last year, and that's all to the good. So you've seen that the UK has joined one of the PESCO projects on military mobility, and that's not just the UK. I think Canada and the US and Norway have also joined this. But this is, I think, a welcome sign that some of the kind of the tensions that took place over the economic relationship with the EU, which overshadowed the security relationship, I think it's welcome that we're moving away from that and towards a more cooperative environment, which can only be good for European security in the medium to long run.
Great, thanks. Charles.
Just to be pedantic on one point, Britain is trying to join the European Mobility Project, and Spain is vetoing that because of Gibraltar. Hopefully they'll lift their veto at some point, but I'm not sure they will. I agree with what Evie and William have said. I mean, I think that although the Tory government, since Sunak became Prime Minister, has done a fairly good job of repairing relations with the EU, this still has a kind of allergy about dealing with the Brussels institutions, which is a shame and which is regretful. And so long as we don't do that, then structures such as the E3 will be seen with more suspicion by European Union members than is deserved. So I think in future, whether there's a Tory government or a Labour government, we have to rebuild ties with the Brussels institutions to take away that feeling of paranoia that the British are out to get them and go round the back of the EU institutions. Then I think the E3 has the potential in certain areas, particularly security, to be quite useful in the future, depending a bit on what happens in the United States.
That's great, thank you. I mean, you know, we seem to have covered an awful lot of ground in the last hour. I'm still not sure whether I'm glass half full or glass half empty about the future of the E3, and that's why we're having a series. So we need to look at the French perspective on the E3 and the German perspective as well. And one of the questions in the Slido by Anonymous is on the start of the Labour Party's ideas about cooperation with Europe. And, you know, I think that's a question that will hold very well for our German and French participants. What's their take on how others are seeing, the UK and what the UK might want? So for no other reason, if you want an answer to that question, make sure you dial into the next two lunchtime sessions, which are on, and then the final event, which is in person. So you can sign up to all of those via the UK and the Changing Europe website. Let me thank our three speakers. Charles Grant, thank you very much for your insight. William, we didn't quite get to the grand strategy questions, but I'm sure we will in the course of this series. And to Evie as well. I mean, all of you have done a fantastic job in sort of setting out the state of play in terms of the relationship between these three states and how that also fits into the current European and sort of EU relationship. So fantastic. And thank you to all of you who have joined us for the discussion. Goodbye.